As the attempts to stymie Brexit become ever more illegitimate and ever more desperate, in the last of my series of What I Expect, I at last turn my attention to Remainers. As losers in the referendum, ordinary Remainers have been dealing with the shock of the result for over 3 years now. They are not alone. It must be some consolation for them to know that the great majority of business leaders, the judiciary, the scientific community, the media, the entertainment industry, Parliament and indeed most of the Conservative government share their shock and their disappointment. It must, however, be difficult for them. To them, Britain was set on a course of continued integration in what was to become, as they probably hoped, the United States of Europe, and as they also probably hoped, with the great and ancient metropolis of London at its centre. Ever closer union was not a threat to them, but an opportunity to be welcomed. With that worldview, we cannot expect them to view Brexit as the scary but exciting adventure that many of us view it as. To them, it is a retrograde step and a retreat from the modern, multicultural, cosmopolitan future that they thought was assured. So we should allow them the time to deal with their disappointment. Some may say, quite reasonably, that they should have taken this past 3 years to grieve over and then finally come to accept the result. Perhaps they should have. Certainly many of those at the top of society in particular might have been more usefully engaged in ensuring a good Brexit, whatever that may mean, rather than continually attempting to sabotage the entire thing. Be that as it may, there are nevertheless things that I still expect of Remainers. This list is somewhat shorter. I expect Remainers to accept the result of the referendum. And as before, there are things that I do not expect from Remainers. I do not expect Remainers to call Brexiteers bigots, racists, fascists, or Nazis. And that's all. Actually, that's not all. With Theresa May's surrender deal having been soundly thrashed 3 times in recent months, no deal should have been the default option. Twice they have kicked the can further down the road in a desperate attempt to prevent delivering on their stated manifesto promises by passing motions to take no deal off the table and sending Theresa May grovelling back to Brussels to beg for an extension to the 31st of October. Consequently, we had a Mexican standoff, with the only 2 options available being no deal, which 500 or so MPs definitely do not want, and revoking Article 50 and officially cancelling Brexit, in this instance even in name. Now, with a new Prime Minister who seems finally to be taking notice that the Conservative Party has just experienced their worst showing in an election since their foundation 185 years ago, and with the Labour Party faring little better, we have the exciting prospect of a real splintering of the 2-party British body politic. Leave voters, disgusted with their treacherous bungling of Brexit and of Labour's equally unprincipled and hedging position, seem to have deserted not only them but also UKIP in their insistence of their decision of 2016 being honoured. Remain voters have also deserted the 2 main parties and seem to have flocked to the Lib Dems to represent their desire, in turn, to remain within the EU. What was interesting about the numbers in the EU elections here is that they appear to mirror almost exactly the referendum result of 3 years ago. With the Brexit Party gaining 29 seats and the DUP in Northern Ireland adding another, the Leave tally was 30 seats. The Remain party's count ended up being 28, with the Lib Dems gaining 16, the Greens 7 and the SNP 3, with Sinn Féin and the Alliance Party in Ulster having 1 each. And that's even if we're being generous to the Remain side, if we are assuming that this election was about nothing except Brexit. given that previously we recently witnessed a sizable climate change protest. That's being pretty generous. It's reasonable, I think, to discount the seats retained by the Conservatives and Labour, since nobody, not even they themselves, know where they stand on the Leave-Remain axis. Indeed, Labour's new policy of a second referendum wasn't in place at the time of that election. So, 30 seats to 28. In 3 years, nothing has changed. There remains no legitimacy for a further referendum. So who knows what's going to happen? Our new head boy, or Prime Minister if you must, the hyper-controversial and nakedly ambitious Boris Johnson, has indicated, or rather refused to rule out, which is media speak for the same thing, that he may get the Queen to prorogue Parliament in order to bypass the solidly Remainer Parliament, if that's the only way of doing it, which seems likely. So instead of acquiescing, as they should, to the majority view, they are instead threatening a sit-in of Parliament and or building a so-called government of national unity to prevent this supposedly unacceptable course of action. The former Prime Minister John Major has even threatened legal action to prevent Boris using this arcane but nevertheless valid course of action. No matter that Major himself used this very same expedient tactic in his tenure as Premier. Only parliamentarians could fail to see that overturning a perfectly fair democratic decision is more unacceptable than going over the heads of Parliament. Parliament desperately wants to revoke Article 50, but cowardly as they are, they know that it would be political suicide for any individual MP who actually voted for it, since, judging by the EU election vote, the electorate will almost certainly take their revenge come next general election time. Assuming, of course, that elections have not been outlawed by then, which can hardly be guaranteed considering the current behaviour of our political class. And there's the rub for Remainers in particular. For Brexiteers, there is a very clear course of action. If you're in a Brexit constituency, find out if your MP voted against your wishes, which, let's face it, they probably did, and vote them out. But Remainers, whether they live in Leave or Remain areas, probably welcome the obstructionist tactics of the MPs, since overturning the vote is what they want. But that is particularly short-sighted of them. Because there's a choice to be made, and it's a clear one. Is your desire to remain within the EU worth abandoning democracy for? After all, what's the bigger prize? Now, after having observed our political system being exposed as almost the antithesis of democracy, and with that fact being humiliatingly broadcast around the world, I'm not about to sit here and say that British democracy is any kind of an example to anyone. Add into the mix that the political establishment is attempting to engineer what is nothing less than a coup d'etat, only adds to that impression. But the point is that Brexit, for all its division, has exposed our political system for what it is, which is nothing more than a bureaucratic autocracy, and is in no way fit for purpose as a way of democratically governing a diverse nation of 65 million people. So I'm not claiming, and nor could I on recent evidence, that our democracy is anything of the sort. So why not instead throw our lot in with the EU? After all, at present and in comparison, the EU looks a model of efficient governance. But that's just the point. Our British system has been found wanting because it has been put under the extreme democratic stress of a referendum. I say extreme not as a pejorative term, but as an ultimate. A referendum is the ultimate and the purest form of democracy. Politicians, predictably, dislike referenda because it diminishes their power by going over their heads. They also say, and make some fair points about referenda being akin to mob rule, in that the majority can use a plebiscite to dictate to the minority. Now, mob rule in the form of a referendum may, in some circumstances, be ugly, but it's not undemocratic. To take that feeling to a logical, but not particularly extreme conclusion, would it be better for the minority to dictate to the majority in order just to avoid mob rule? Of course it wouldn't. The way that you avoid mob rule is by adhering not to the rule of the mob, but to the rule of law, so that the individual citizen remains respected, even if he is outvoted. But currently we do have the minority attempting, and currently succeeding, in overruling the majority, with less than 500 MPs overriding the wishes of 17.4 million people. And that's the way our politicians like it, with their vote counting for about 35,000 times more than ours. That's the kind of democracy they like. So it is my contention that if any country in the EU, or even the EU as a whole, was subjected to the pure democracy of a referendum, the EU might well vote itself out of existence overnight. Those in power in the EU know this, which is why the chances of any of those countries ever having a referendum on anything substantial ever again has now been seriously reduced. The British government must have assured the EU that there was no way they'd lose the vote, which is almost certainly why they were permitted the indulgence in the first place. They won't make that mistake again. Now, Remainers probably enjoyed the thrashing around in indecisive idiocy of the previous Theresa May administration, since they believed that their utter incompetence made Brexit less likely. It is, however, with Boris now at the helm, a high-stakes game, and it still looks as if it's going to go down to the wire, even though that wire has been pushed back all the way to the 31st of October. It seemed as if the reversal of Brexit was only possible with the revocation of Article 50. Only an extremely brave, extremely foolhardy, or extremely stubborn Remainer, such as Ken Clarke, would risk the ire of their Leave constituents and vote for such a thing without the mandate of a second referendum. No, the 6 months extension, which seems a lot, particularly if you voted Leave, that has been granted gives the government no more than a breathing space and appears to be merely prolonging the agony. As I mentioned in What I Expect of the British government, that long 6 months extension, which has already been half spent, in reality amounts to no more than about a month's worth of debate, given MPs' penchant for 3-day weeks, long weekends and relaxed holidays. So now that the bafflingly spineless Remainers in Parliament have managed to grant themselves another few months in which to conspire to overturn the result, ordinary Remainers may be feeling encouraged that Brexit may after all be avoided. So let's imagine for argument's sake that that is what happens, and by some tortuous process involving this illegitimate and seditious so-called Government of National Unity, Article 50 is revoked and Brexit is cancelled. What then? Do all the Brexiteers simply shrug their collective shoulders and go home? Do Remainers in turn themselves also go home, but with a spring in their step, believing that a disaster has been averted and that their beloved European Union is now safe from what they believe to be its greatest threat? And if they do, is that the end of it? No. No, it bloody is not, because something has been sacrificed to maintain this status quo, and that something is nothing less than democracy itself. The notion of democracy has been the rallying cry of Brexiteers since the result of the referendum came in. Remainers, on the other hand, have argued more pragmatically, at least as they would see it, that Brexit was just a dreadful practical error, that it was too risky, that it would cost the economy too much, that Britain would be poorer, weaker, less influential than it would otherwise have been if we had stayed in. They've also attempted to suggest that Brexiteers somehow cared less for their children and grandchildren than noble Remainers, and are lesser people as a result. For the children, they would bleat, as if willingly removing their children from a democracy into an autocracy that is on a fast track to become a dictatorship is somehow a good thing. That selling one's children and grandchildren into a system over which they will have less and less control is somehow the moral position. But wishing to live in a democracy should not just be the position of Brexiteers. Is it somehow improper to suggest that Remainers might also be concerned with such a thing? As I've said, British democracy has been exposed to be nothing of the kind. But does anyone seriously think that if that same question was asked in Italy or France or even Germany, that they may also have had the same existential convulsions? And what about Greece? Poor downtrodden Greece. What do you think they would have said? This is not about British exceptionalism, and nor is it about nostalgia for an imperial past. At this point, it's not even about Brexit. For us, for most of us, it is, and has become more so with every passing day, just about democracy. It's about accountability. It's about making our own decisions, however misguided they may be. We are not children that need to be saved from ourselves. So, all you Remainers, do not imagine that Brexit comes without a cost. Don't imagine that it's free. It isn't. It's very, very expensive. Because it will cost you just as much as it costs us. Although you won't feel it as acutely as we do now, I can assure you with complete conviction that the bill is in the post. You won't feel it today, as we do, but you'll feel it when your time comes. And when it comes, that cost will likely be more than you are prepared to pay. For now, the cost of a betrayed and cancelled Brexit, if it comes to that, will be borne by us. But having broken the democratic mandate and the damn principle that goes with it, when it's your turn to have a say on something that you hold dear, or on something that you just cannot allow, and even if a majority of you vote against it, your voice will be denied to you. And the worst thing is, having fought for the EU and against democracy, you will have been complicit in your own subjugation. So, what do I expect of Remainers? I expect them to fucking stand up for democracy. That's what.